Hey, RetconRaider here, and welcome back to part 2 of my Factions of Phoenix Point Revisited series. Last time, we talked about the militant transhumanists of New Jericho, so this week I thought we'd continue by taking a look at everything we currently know about the scientific collective known as Synedrion. In many ways, Synedrion can be seen as the polar opposite of New Jericho. Where New Jericho focuses on the advancement of military technology, Synedrion focuses on the advance of science. Where New Jericho is founded on libertarian political values, Synedrion is founded on the tenets of anarchism and communism. Where New Jericho advocates for the complete and utter destruction of the Pandora virus, Synedrion advocates for coexistence. At its core, Synedrion is essentially an ecological group intent on preserving mankind, saving it by finding a new niche for humanity to occupy in a world dominated by an entirely new invasive species. They observed how the nations of the world attempted and failed to repel the Pandora virus with violence during World War III, and have come to the conclusion that it simply isn't practical to attempt to defeat the Pandora virus. So they instead have dedicated their significant resources towards finding new ways to survive alongside it. Their main focus is on survival of the species, whether it's against the alien invaders or against other more aggressive factions. This mindset is evidenced by the original name planned for the faction, Sanctuary, which can still be seen in some of the older interviews. As their name implies, Synedrion is a faction led by a committee. They lack a central leader, instead relying on democratic votes to shape their policies or determine their course of action. It is through these democratic votes that Synedrion has formed the core principles of its society, which revolve around such tenets as the guarantee of personal freedoms, the protection of basic human rights, and communalism instead of commercialism. Synedrion also believes the world's new ecology should be preserved where possible, and that conflict should be met with passive resistance when practical, although they will still respond with violence if they deem it necessary, for the purposes of self-defense or survival. But, we'll get back to that a little later in the video. In theory, Synedrion will be an easy faction to ally with, but one that may be difficult to work with long-term, unless the player is willing to abide by their standards. Players who are overly aggressive in dealing with the Pandora virus, or the other factions, may find that Synedrion does not approve of their methods. Though on the bright side, it's exceedingly unlikely that Synedrion would ever actively attack the player, unless the player deliberately provoked them first. Where some factions, such as the Disciples of Anu and the Phoenix Project, are shrouded in mystery, Synedrion is somewhat unusual because its origin is clearly spelled out in the fiction available on the official Phoenix Point website. There are 3 key stories that expand upon the lore behind the faction. There's the Synedrion short story, which is where we get most of the information we have about their ideology, as well as The Second Step and Towards Freedom, which instead focus on the faction's origins. Now, I've talked about the Firebird Initiative before, but since it's an integral part of Synedrion's backstory, let's briefly revisit everything we learned about them. According to The Second Step, the Firebird Initiative was founded sometime in the late 2020s, or the early 2030s, around the same time that the Pandora virus was spreading throughout the planet's oceans, and the first clouds of microbial mist were starting to form. Although various national governments were beginning to investigate this phenomenon, tensions were high, and research efforts were being crippled by a lack of international cooperation. The Firebird Initiative was started by a Russian couple, Stanislav and Nikolai, who began a crowdfunding effort in Moscow with the promise of releasing all of their findings to the public, for the greater good. They quickly found several benefactors willing to fund their research, including groups such as Vanadium Inc., the Phoenix Project, and even the Disciples of Anu. Their efforts also drew numerous additional scientists from around the globe, and was anonymously bolstered with research data leaked or stolen from various governments. While this did allow them to quickly move forward with their research, their methods also drew harsh criticism, and even opposition from both government bodies and radical activist groups. This ultimately led to their undoing, after one of those activist groups detonated an IED in their parking lot, killing 2 members of the initiative, and badly injuring both of its founders. Towards Freedom, set decades later after the events of World War III, revealed that the remnants of the Firebird Initiative had joined up with several other like-minded individuals to found Synedrion. Their first haven was established on Mount Lycabettus over the embattled streets of Athens, which served as a haven for civilians who had been tricked by the local government into previously seeking shelter at ineffectual safe zones. Although this early version of Synedrion was led by a democratic council, Stanislav and Nikolai, the former founders of the Firebird Initiative, played key roles. Most notably, their research from the initiative was used to develop the technology that would protect their new haven from the mists and mutants that were overrunning Athens. In fact, Towards Freedom gives us a glimpse at a few of the key technologies that keep Synedrion running. The early warning system and mist-repelling technology both seem to be the result of the Firebird Initiative's research, and together they form the first line of defense for every Synedrion haven. The story also gives us our first glimpse at Synedrion's distinctive domed settlements, which are essentially armored biodomes, designed to primarily keep the growing hostile alien ecology out, but also strong enough to turn aside a direct missile strike. Perhaps less flashy, but no less important, is the hydroponics program that Stanislav appears to have spearheaded. This presumably allows Synedrion to feed its population more easily than other factions. But the one thing that all 3 of these pieces of technology have in common is that they're all designed with defense and self-sufficiency in mind. And really, after reviewing all of the available information, I think it's safe to say that, despite all their idealism and their scientific rationalization, in the end, Synedrion is a faction that is dedicated towards the survival of the species above all else. Where New Jericho is almost entirely dedicated toward things like expansion and offense, Synedrion is almost the exact opposite, with a distinct focus on setting clearly defined borders and mounting an almost impenetrable defense. While they do promote things like personal freedoms, pacifism, and the advancement of science, these are all secondary concerns when compared to safety and self-sufficiency. It's important to remember that Synedrion is not led by any one leader, and their response to any perceived threat could theoretically change at a moment's notice, in the time it takes them to finish tallying a vote. The situation in Athens is a good example of this. Facing increased aggression from the government holdouts in the city below, as well as a growing crisis due to their shortage of supplies, Synedrion held a vote, ultimately deciding to send an assault team into Athens. Led by Nikolai, they rounded up the fleeing government holdouts, killed the ones who resisted, executed the ones who tried to negotiate, seized their supplies, and then left at least some of the survivors behind to die as punishment for their perceived crimes. While an argument could certainly be made toward Synedrion's actions being justified, it certainly flies in the face of their claims towards pacifism. The actions they took that day certainly far exceeded what most people would probably consider self-defense. In retrospect, I think it's clear that the actions taken that day were largely driven by Nikolai, once an idealistic scientist, but now a bitter and vengeful pragmatist, following the collapse of the Firebird Initiative years earlier. And ultimately, that is likely to be one of the most defining features of the faction. It seems very likely that, despite their idealistic policies, Synedrion will almost certainly be quick to adapt to new threats. Julian Gollop has hinted at this in the past, and I think it's safe to say that if the player, or one of the other factions, ends up antagonizing Synedrion, then they'll quickly see the faction take a turn towards more aggressive behavior. Though this does lead to some potentially interesting speculation. Would it be possible for the player to shape Synedrion's growth by influencing who ends up on their voting committee? If the members who support nonviolence or coexistence with the Pandora virus just happen to die or otherwise become neutralized, would the player be able to goad Synedrion into accepting increasingly aggressive or outright violent behavior? It's an interesting thought, and something I'm looking forward to testing in the final game. Now, from a gameplay standpoint, the biggest benefits of allying with Synedrion are obvious. They have access to incredible research and technology, chief among them the technology that protects their havens from the Pandora virus. Beyond that, it's also very likely that Synedrion will provide an allied player with other useful resources, such as better research personnel and better haven growth. Things like armored domes and hydroponics would make it much easier for the Phoenix Project to establish safe, secure bases all over the globe. But that's not to say that Synedrion is only good for defense. It's also been established that they will be the only faction that begins the game with access to energy weapon technology. This is something that other factions will theoretically gain over time, but if the player wants energy weapons as quickly as possible, then they'll need to get it from Synedrion. Further, Synedrion has advanced battlefield technology, generally focused on improving things like defense, mobility, and reconnaissance. In stark contrast to the heavy, weapon-laden power armor designed by New Jericho, Synedrion's own power armor designs are instead focused on enhancing mobility and scouting range. For example, it has been confirmed that every faction will have access to the Infiltrator specialty class, a class focused on things like stealth, evasion, recon, and mobility. Each faction will have their own slightly different approach when it comes to using this class, but it has been outright stated that Synedrion has the most advanced technology to offer, at least where infiltrators are concerned. Similarly, Synedrion will also be known for developing aerial drones with a wide variety of functions both in and out of combat, a stark contrast to the purely offense-oriented weapons platforms developed by New Jericho. This makes it likely that the Drone Hive backpack mentioned in the Infiltrator update will be a device of Synedrion design. Ultimately, it will be up to the player to decide if they want to work with or against Synedrion. There are numerous clear benefits to an alliance, but in the end it's important to remember that they're a faction built on a disparate, fractured set of worldviews, any one of which could end up influencing the group in a direction that the player might not anticipate. Although founded on the tenets of scientific reason, it's entirely possible that Synedrion might end up turning on the player in an instant, depending on the direction the campaign takes, and the decisions that the player might be forced to make. And of course, if all else fails, the player can still theoretically get at least some of that exclusive tech through more forceful methods. Just don't expect Synedrion to take it lying down. You might end up being surprised at just how vicious they can get. So, that covers what we know about 2 of the 3 factions. Just one more to go. So next weekend, we'll be taking a look at everything we know about the mutated disciples of Anu. Are they really as crazy as they seem? Well, probably, but we'll get into that next time. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out all the latest news by visiting the official website or the crowdfunding campaign on Fig. Links are in the description.